So a few weeks ago when we started this series of I Wish Jesus Hadn't Said That, we dealt with Jesus saying to deny yourself and take up your cross. And I said at that point when we dealt with that one that might be the toughest one that we deal with in this whole series. And I realized something along the way, that the reason that is the toughest is because all the other ones kind of are incorporated into it. Because that's how we deal with these statements. We become more like Jesus on a daily basis by denying ourselves, taking up our cross, and that's how we deal with and come through some of these statements that are hard for us in human nature. In other words, we're trying to become more and more like Jesus, and the way we do that is we deny ourselves and take up our cross. And I was thinking about that as I was thinking through this week, because I was realizing how tough this statement that we're dealing with today is when we really dig into it, when we really get into what Jesus was meaning. And honestly, as I was studying and thinking through it, I was getting a little discouraged, because we talk about loving our neighbor, but then we always try to qualify who our neighbor is, don't we? And sometimes it's very hard. It's easy to do. It's easy to love our neighbor until we realize that Jesus is saying our neighbor is everyone. That everyone around us is our neighbor. And then it gets a little more daunting, doesn't it? For some reason, we just have a hard time loving people that maybe not exactly like us. It's easy to love our neighbors when they think like us, or when they vote like us, or when they have the same morals as us, or they dress like us, or they generally enjoy the same things as us. It's easy to love someone like that, isn't it? Because basically you're loving yourself. But what happens when those similarities start becoming differences? They think differently. They vote differently. Their morals are different. They dress different. They enjoy things that we don't understand. We start trying to say then that maybe they're not our neighbors. Or maybe we don't come out and say it, but that's the way we try to live. We don't treat them as neighbors. So let's look at our text today. It's one that you're more than likely familiar with. It's one of Jesus' most famous parables, the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's found in Luke 10, verses 25 through 37. It says, "Then an expert in the law stood up to test him, saying, 'Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?'" We all want to know that, right? We all want to know what it takes. "What is written in the law?" he asked him. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And if you look at the 10 Commandments, those two statements right there incorporate all 10 Commandments. And Jesus answered, "You've answered correctly," he told him. "Do this and you will live." But the guy was still trying to test Jesus and still trying to justify himself. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" That's what we all ask at this point, isn't it? Who is my neighbor? And Jesus took up the question and said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him, beat him up, and fled, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. In the same way, a Levite, when he arrived at the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, on his journey, came up to him, and when he saw the man, he had compassion. He went over to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on olive oil and wine. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him. When I come back, I'll reimburse you for whatever extra you spend.' which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The one who showed mercy to him, he said, and Jesus told him, go and do the same. When we read through that story, we understand that the Samaritan is an unlikely hero. We've been told that our whole lives. And we're really kind of disappointed that the priest and the Levite didn't do anything. But we make excuses for them. Oh, they were on their way to the temple. They couldn't touch a dead or hurt body, or that would make them unclean. But I think a lot of times we don't understand how shocking this would have been to the crowd that Jesus tells this story. You see, first and foremost, it wouldn't have been too shocking to them that the priest and the Levite didn't take care of him. But for a Samaritan to be the hero of a story that a Jewish rabbi was telling would have been completely unheard of. It's because the Jews looked at the Samaritans and looked at them as half-blood or half-bred. They weren't necessarily Gentiles, but they weren't considered Jews because they had intermarried with other people around Samaria. And because of that, they were not looked upon with any kind of favor from the Jews. They didn't consider them to be worshiping the same God in the right way, or to even be their kin as they used to be. So we have this expert in the law that's trying to test Jesus. And he even tries to justify himself by asking the question that we all ask: who is my neighbor? And it's that question that prompts Jesus to tell the story of the Good Samaritan. And they would have been familiar that this road from Jericho to Jerusalem was a very dangerous road. It would have not been unlikely that people would have been robbed and beaten on this road. But when you read the original language as well, it actually says that the Levite and the priest not only passed by on the other side, it says that they went up. They actually crossed the road to get a good look and to see this person beaten on the side of the road, and then chose to walk away. And then Jesus asks a question at the end. He says, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robber? And I think it's interesting that the expert of the law couldn't even bring himself to say that it was the Samaritan that was the neighbor. He said the one who showed him mercy. He couldn't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. And then Jesus hits us with, go and do the same. And that wasn't just to the expert of the law. That was to us. We are to show mercy and love everyone. So why? Why do we have such a hard time putting this into practice? Why do we try to qualify who our neighbor is? Like we think that the answer is going to change. We know who Jesus says our neighbor is, but we still ask that question hoping that maybe he's going to let us off the hook. I've told you the story about the Princeton Seminary experiment based off the Good Samaritan before, but I wanted to familiarize yourself with it again. It's really interesting because all the participants in this study were seminary students studying to become some kind of professional ministry. So they should have not only known the story, they should have been trying to put this into practice. But the statistics that we see from that story, or from that scenario, basically what happened was they put together a group of students and told them that they had to put together either a lesson on the Good Samaritan, or they were talking about what it meant to be a seminary student. Some of them were told that they had plenty of time to get to the place that they were supposed to teach this, and others were told that they were already running behind. So those were the scenarios that were set up. While they were on the way to the place that they were supposed to be teaching, there was a man set in a doorway that looked like he was either beaten or drunk. As the students walked by him, he coughed twice, drawing attention to himself. Over 40% in this study actually offered some help to the victim. But surprisingly, it wasn't the basic difference between whether somebody helped or not was if they were told that they were running late or if they had plenty of time. Over 40% total offered help, but in low hurry situations, or in other words, they had plenty of time, 63% of those stopped and helped in one way or another. If they were medium hurry, they were told they were running a little behind, but they had a little time, 45% stopped. But if they were told that they were already late, only 10% stopped to help. For helping relevant message, 53%. A task relevant message, 29%. And there was no correlation between religious types. They had to take a survey of what kind of religion or what they were trying to accomplish with their religion. And there was no correlation between religious types as to who stopped to help. So ironically, a person in a hurry was less likely to help people, even if he's going to speak on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And this was the sad part to me. Some of these people that didn't stop literally stepped over the victim on their way to the next building. Not just bypassed him, literally stepped over the person. The results seem to show that thinking about norms does not imply that one will act on them. Maybe that ethics become a luxury as the speed of our daily lives increases. Or maybe people's cognition was narrowed by the hurriedness and they failed to make the immediate connection of an emergency. The study ended up saying at the end that many subjects who did not stop did appear aroused and anxious when they arrived at the second site. They were in conflict between helping the victim and meeting the needs of the experiment. So conflict rather than callousness can actually explain some of the failure to stop in this. But the fact of the matter is, people that understood the story of the Good Samaritan still stepped over or refused to help in a lot of ways. So my question is, could it be that we are just in too big of a hurry to help someone? Or could it be that we really don't want to admit that someone that is different from us is still loved by God? Or is it that we just want to be lazy? Or is it that we just naturally turn a blind eye? I think for some people, all of those are possibilities. But I find it interesting, again, that in the experiment, that most of the ones that didn't help knew that they should have. They were conflicted because they didn't. So Jesus tells us to love our neighbor. And when our neighbors are like us, that's easy. But let's expand that thought just a little. So love your neighbor who doesn't look like you, who doesn't think like you, or love like you, or speak like you, or pray like you, or vote like you. In other words, love your neighbor, no exceptions. Or maybe just for a little more clarity, love your neighbor, your homeless neighbor, your Muslim neighbor, your black neighbor, your gay neighbor, your white neighbor, your Jewish neighbor, your transgendered neighbor, your Christian neighbor, your atheist neighbor, your racist neighbor, your addicted neighbor. Some of those descriptions are just like us. Others are the complete opposite of us. But that doesn't mean that we approve of their sin. I'm not saying that. But we still love the person. One scenario that unfortunately seems to be really on a on a tipping point in this country right now is the realm of politics. And you know me, I don't get into politics. I'm not going to say one side or another on this. But Democrats hate Republicans. Republicans hate Democrats. Even if they're Christian, they hate each other. Their political divide seems to matter more than what we have in common as Christians. And that shouldn't be, guys. Come on. I came across this pic the other day, and before you put it up, Dave, I'll tell you when. Dave saw this slide and came out and said, "Are you trying to start a war? So just be prepared." Go ahead and put it up. We must stop electing Democrats. Heed this message. Trump is America's last hope. Really? Trump is America's last hope? Jesus is America's only hope. And you can put stop electing Republicans and that Obama was America's last hope. I don't care who you put on that. Jesus is America's only hope. He is our only hope. And He says to love one another. Democrat or Republican, this has got to stop. No political figure is America's last hope. I don't care what name you put on there. We have got to get over that idea. We have to come united under the one thing that should unite us all, and that is Jesus Christ. Jesus is America's last hope. No, He's not America's last hope. He's America's only hope. And He tells us, again, to love our neighbor. Do I wish He hadn't said that? Sometimes, yeah, I do. But in the end, I'm really glad He did. If you need to make any decision this morning, now's the time to do so as we stand and sing I Surrender All, number 596. We're going to sing all verses.